Good morning. I am beyond honored to get the opportunity to share a few brief moments with you. My wife and I, Quinn, live in the dark tundra of the Pacific Northwest. And I will confess to you this morning, we both woke up and made a major decision in our life. We think God is inviting us to move to Santa Barbara. Yeah. It was a stark shift just a few moments ago when somebody shared with me some of the real estate prices. And we think maybe God is not inviting us to move to Santa Barbara. But nonetheless, the hospitality over the course of the last 48 hours has been nothing short of glorious. And it is very evident that the Spirit of God is at work in your community. Thank you for being so gracious and kind. The most important thing we bought in our family during the pandemic was we made a strategic decision to buy a hot tub. It became, as it were, a kind of sanctuary for our family. In the evenings, it would be the place where my wife, my son, and I would gather together on a nightly basis and just talk. And it was in the hot tub that my son would bring out, and has always been in the hot tub at night, has always brought out his deepest questions about God. It has been over the course of the last few years that we've decided it's time for our 11-year-old son to begin to enter into a broader conversation that you and I would call the birds and the bees. It's a challenging, interesting, and shocking conversation for an 11-year-old. He looks at his parents a little bit differently now than he did when he was 5. But it's an important conversation nonetheless. One of the most important things that my wife and I get to serve our son with is we get to be safe people with whom he can ask any question. We all have questions about life, about God, about our existence. And we will all take our questions somewhere. For the generation that I serve as a university professor, as a theologian, as a Bible scholar, if my classroom is not a safe space for my students to ask questions, unfortunately, they'll take their questions to the internet. The classroom is an important place to ask questions. The church is an important place to ask questions. And while all of us have questions, some of them more on the light side, conversations like the birds and the bees, the reality is for some of us this morning, our questions bear more pain. The question of a recent cancer diagnosis, God, why? A child who has undergone a major loss and you're grieving alongside them, God, why? Loss, suffering, existential crises. God, where are you? What are you doing? We all need a place to take our questions. Thus, the importance of Psalm 73. This morning, we read a lengthy reading from Psalm 73. It has been traditionally called, in some circles and by some commentators, a psalm for doubt. The author of this particular psalm is a man named Asaph. Asaph is one of the authors of the Psalms. There are, of course, many authors of the Psalms, but Asaph is attributed as having written approximately 11 of the Psalms in the Psalter. Asaph, what we know, is likely a worship leader from the lineage of the Levite community. He was perhaps a prophet in David's court. He's a son of Asaph, who was one of the family guilds in the temple as a temple musician. And when you listen to this psalm, I want you to just briefly focus on 3 things. I want you to see first Asaph's confession, his praise, and this sanctuary. First, the confession. I want to point out to you, as you listen to this psalm, I want to point out just briefly, as it relates to Asaph confessing what he's really experiencing, I want you to notice how incredibly honest this psalm is. And I want you to recognize how all of the psalms are profoundly honest. This is a worship leader. This is a man tasked with leading the community into worship. And whoever it is that is writing this, Asaph, he is bearing the reality of his life. He is not holding back his experience. Why I think that's so critically important for us at this moment in history is we must remember worship is not the place we go to escape reality. It is the place we go to face it. Asaph is experiencing tremendous loss, doubt, envy, and anger, and he names it. I must confess, in the circles that I run in, often our worship leader, our worship music is so incredibly triumphalistic. Everything is great. All is well. There are no problems here, God. And the only problem with that is if that is the only way we know how to worship, then where do we take our pain? You see, Asaph has a different way of worshiping God. He doesn't come to God with only the happiness and the joy, which is an important form of worship, but rather we see Asaph come to God with what is really happening in his life. As a Bible scholar, I can't help but notice little things like this to me scream the inspiration of the Bible. Here is why. Name one other religion in the world that inspires texts that critique God. The author is telling God he's mad at God. Where are you? What are you doing? The Bible is not insecure. God can handle our questions. And not only can he handle them, he welcomes them. Bear them. Don't hold them back. Worship is not the space you go to get away from reality. It is the place you go to bear it. And this morning, that idea of confession might be helped by understanding the New Testament word for confession. In the New Testament, the word that's used for confession is the Greek word homologeo. It's a compound word between homo, which means one, legeo, to see. It's the idea of agreeing with somebody. When you confess to God, you are agreeing with what God is saying. It is not, mind you, telling God something God does not already know. That's tremendous news. When we confess to God, we are not letting God in on a secret he was unaware of. We are welcoming him into something he already knew. Think about that. The next time you confess to God anything, there has never been a moment in human history when somebody has prayed to God and God walked away more informed. Never once has God walked away and thought to himself, well, that is an interesting perspective. I've never thought of it from that angle. When you confess to God, you are telling God something he already knows. All you're doing is acknowledging to him that you know he knows and that you need a friend in the middle of it. Name it. Confession is not telling God something he doesn't know. Confession is naming to God something God already knows, and you are just willing to walk with him through it. I want you to see as well the way that Asaph praises God. This is a praise psalm. The Psalter is filled with 150 songs of praise to God. This is praise to God, but it's an interesting kind of praise. Again, in my little circle of Christianity, when we talk about praise music, what we usually mean is music that makes our adrenal gland pump out more chemicals into our bodies. Praise is excitement. But it is it is worth noting that in the psalm, sometimes praise is dark. In fact, we have a whole category of psalms called imprecatory psalms. You've read them before and had no idea what to do with them. These are psalms where the psalmist says things like, God, I want you to break the teeth of my enemies. I'm curious if you have those readings done here. And do you awkwardly just sort of move on? It actually turns out in some circles of Christianity, imprecatory psalms have been taken out of common readings as a result of believing that people cannot handle the rage of the Bible. And the truth is, the Bible, it takes human rage and incorporates it into its story. Not as a way of saying revenge or rage in and of themselves are good. But when the Bible takes human rage and incorporates it, what it's doing is it's saying to us that part of praise is loving God even with our difficult emotions. We don't merely worship God with our happy feelings. We also worship God with our anger. And by the way, the cool thing about these imprecatory psalms, it's been pointed out by commentators, is that there's no evidence that Asaph, after this psalm, actually went out and beat some guy up. He names it to God, but that becomes the end of it. Why? Because we must have a place to take our anger. If we don't have a God who can handle it, we will take it to people. Words are not violence. Words before God are actually what keep us from being violent. I would argue that a church without the imprecatory psalms is a church that will eventually turn to violence. We must have a place to take our language. Ellen Davis at Duke University has called the imprecatory psalms the First Amendment of the Bible. They are our free expression to God of what's really happening. One of the distinctive marks of these psalms I find to be one of my favorites is that by the time these psalms are done, you'll notice this, by the way, is that in the psalms, the author they'll kind of get at God. They'll say, God, why have you allowed this? God, why is this happening? God, why are you letting these things happen? God, why are the wicked prospering? God, why is everybody happy but I'm not? But you'll notice at the end of the psalm, something will change. So they'll just be mad at God, and then in the end, they'll say this, but I praise you, God. But I love you. We call these, this is called anticipatory praise. And the idea here is this, is that the author is showing us that we don't worship God after everything has worked out. Rather, we worship God in the middle of things not working out. And that the way of loving God in the midst of our questions is that we bear our love to God in the middle of it, not after it's all finished. There is a way to praise. But that's not the end. There's one last element of this psalm, and that is the sanctuary. If anybody was paying close attention to the reading of the text, you're going to notice that 3 different times in this text, the phrase surely or nevertheless was used. In some psalms, it's the word yet. And that is that this psalm, verse 1, 13, and 18, is structured around these statements. Yet surely, God, you are good. Yet surely, God, you are majestic. Yet surely, God, you are sovereign. And something changes in verse 18. The author appears to have, in some way, shape, or form, broken through to God. Scholars think maybe what has happened is that somewhere around verse 18, Asaph has entered into the sanctuary of God and has now found their hope. They've come face to face with God. They see God in their pain. This is, of course, the story of Job. When you read the story of Job, you are struck by how much this man has lost. He's lost everything: his family, his career, his reputation, his understanding of God. For nearly 37 chapters, Job has a speech he wants to give to God. He wants God to hear it from him. And finally, in Job 37 and Job 38, Job comes before God. And yet, when Job finally comes in the presence of God, Job does not get one word out. In fact, the questions are not from Job to God. God has some questions for Job. Oh, were you there when I made the foundations of the earth? Were you there when I created the Leviathan? The lesson of Job is this: God's answer to our suffering is not answers. God's answer to our suffering is his presence. That he is with us. George Whitefield years ago used to say, when you look at Job, we tend to think of Job as like some other person. Oh, that poor guy that suffered. But Whitefield loved to remind us that actually at the end of the day, the story of Job is the story of every single one of us. We will all lose everything. What will we be when we have? I like to put it this way: Job gave everything away. He gave it all away. At the end of the day, we are all generous eventually. We will get there. We will all give it away. And the story of Job and the story of Asaph this morning is not that you may get an answer, but you can get the presence of God. And today, in the dark, as we worship in the dark, the God of the universe, he may not have all the answers for you, but he, like with Job, he gives you himself. And that, friends, is like Jesus walking into the room and saying, "Peace be with you." Peace himself, the Prince of Peace, is actually with you.